He threw the envelope at her feet like she was a stray dog begging at his door. Not handed it, threw it. The coins scattered across the wooden platform of Iron Hollow's train station, spinning and rolling between the boots of 50 strangers who stood watching in silence. Meredith Rowan looked down at that money, every cent she'd need to survive the next 2 weeks, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not shame, rage. She had crossed 2,000 miles for this man, sold her father's desk, slept sitting upright in a train car for 4 nights, written letters so careful and so honest that her fingers had cramped for hours afterward. And Harold Fenwick, this soft-handed, pink-faced merchant with gold buttons on his coat, stood above her on that platform and announced to the entire town that she was too old. 31 years old, too old. If you were standing on that platform watching a woman stare at coins on the ground while a crowd held its breath, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, challenge you, or remind you of someone you've known, please subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Iron Hollow, Montana, 1883, and to the moment that changed everything. The morning had started with dust. That was Montana in September. Dust in your teeth before breakfast. Dust on the collar of your only good dress. Dust settling into the creases around your eyes that no amount of water seemed to wash clean. Meredith had stood in the cramped washroom of the boarding house where she'd spent her last night, the one she'd paid for with the second-to-last bill folded into her left boot, and she had looked at herself in a mirror so old and warped it barely reflected anything useful. She looked tired. She knew she looked tired. She'd pressed her lips together, pinched color into her cheeks with 2 fingers the way her mother had taught her, and told herself that tired was not the same as beaten. She'd been telling herself that for about 3 years. Meredith had come from Dayton, Ohio, where she'd spent the last decade managing the legal and financial records of her father's small law practice. Edmund Rowan had been an honest man with an extraordinary mind and absolutely no talent for keeping himself alive. He died of pneumonia the previous winter, leaving behind a daughter who understood contracts and double-entry bookkeeping better than most men twice her age, and a practice that died with him because in 1882, nobody hired a woman to do a lawyer's work, no matter how well she did it. She'd tried to find work in Dayton, then Columbus, then Cincinnati. The answer was always polite and always the same. "We appreciate your qualifications, Miss Rowan, but our clients prefer to work with..." She stopped listening after the 3rd time. The advertisement had appeared in a Women's Correspondence Gazette her neighbor subscribed to. A prosperous merchant in Iron Hollow, Montana sought a capable wife. Practical woman preferred. Widow or spinster welcome. Must be of sound character and willing to work. There was a postal address. There was a promise of correspondence. There was no photograph. Meredith had written back with the same precision she brought to legal briefs. She stated her age. She wasn't going to lie about 31. That seemed like a foolish foundation. Her experience, her skills, her health, and her circumstances. She wrote 3 drafts. She sent the 4th. Harold Fenwick wrote back within 2 weeks. His letters were warm, almost charming. He described his store, his standing in town, his belief that a practical woman of intelligence was worth 10 times the prettiest girl who couldn't balance a household ledger. He used the word partnership twice. He never mentioned love, which Meredith actually respected. She wasn't naive enough to expect love from a man she'd never met. She expected honesty. She expected fair dealing. She expected the basic human courtesy of being looked in the eye. What she got instead was Harold Fenwick on a train platform with 50 people watching. He had seen her step off the train, and she had watched his face change. It was one of those things that happened too fast for him to hide. A flicker of something, calculation maybe, or disappointment. Gone in less than a second, but she caught it the way you catch a lie from someone who's almost learned not to tell them. She had extended her hand and smiled and said, "Mr. Fenwick, it's a pleasure to finally meet you properly." He hadn't taken her hand. He'd said, with the particular cruelty of a man who needs an audience to feel powerful, "You didn't mention you were this far along in years." Meredith had held her smile because it was the only armor she had. "I stated my age clearly in my first letter, Mr. Fenwick. 31 looks different written down." Someone in the crowd laughed. She didn't look to find out who. I find, she said, keeping her voice even, that most things look different in person. That was when he reached into his coat pocket and produced the envelope. Small, white. He held it out toward her for just a moment, and then, when she didn't reach for it fast enough, or maybe because he wanted the whole platform watching, he let it drop. Not drop. Through. The coins scattered. People flinched. Someone made a small sound of surprise. Meredith looked at the money on the ground. She looked at Harold Fenwick's pink, self-satisfied face. She looked at the crowd, some uncomfortable, some curious. One older woman near the edge with her hand pressed against her mouth. She thought about bending down. She decided not to. "Keep it," she said. Her voice didn't shake, which she would consider a private victory for the rest of her life. "I don't believe we have anything further to discuss." Harold Fenwick blinked. He hadn't expected that. Men like Harold Fenwick never expected a woman with nothing to say no to something. "You've got no money," he said, lower now, almost private, which made it worse somehow. "You've got nowhere to go. You think your pride is worth starving for?" "I think," Meredith said, "that some prices are too high to pay even when you're starving." She picked up her traveling bag, the one with the broken brass clasp she'd been meaning to fix for 2 months, and she turned away from Harold Fenwick and his scattered coins and his audience. She walked approximately 6 steps before she realized she had absolutely no idea where she was going. Iron Hollow was a single main street with ambitions. A general store. A livery. A hotel that looked like it had survived one fire and wasn't sure about its odds against a second. A law office. A saloon that was doing better business at 9 in the morning than any of its neighbors. She had $6 hidden in her left boot and $4 and some coins in her bag, and she knew the boarding house money was gone. She could try the hotel. She could sit in the law office and hope the attorney needed a clerk. She could turn around and retrieve Harold Fenwick's scattered money from between the boots of people who were now carefully looking elsewhere. She kept walking. What she didn't see, because she was focused very deliberately on not crying in a public street, was the man who had stepped away from the edge of the crowd and was watching her walk away with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't admiration exactly, but was something in between the two. Silas Blackridge was 43 years old and had the particular look of a man who had spent those years mostly outdoors and mostly working. He wasn't tall in the dramatic sense, but he was solid in the way that mountains are solid. Not trying to impress anyone, just difficult to move. He wore dust on his coat the same way he wore the scar along his left jawline, which is to say, without particular attention to it. He had been in town to pick up wire and grain invoices, and he had witnessed the entire scene on the platform from 30 feet away because the noise had drawn him out of the hardware supplier's doorway. He had seen the envelope thrown. He had seen her refuse to pick it up. He had watched her walk away. He made a decision in about the time it takes to exhale. "Miss." Meredith stopped. She turned. She looked at him with the particular wariness of a woman who has just had a very bad morning and is not interested in making it more complicated. "I'm not looking for sympathy," she said. It came out sharper than she intended. "Good," Silas said. "I'm not offering any. I'm looking for a housekeeper." She stared at him. "My ranch is 12 miles out," he said. "It's got a cook's quarters with a wood stove, a household that hasn't been properly managed in about 8 months, a crew of 7 men who've been eating the kind of food you have when nobody's in charge of the kitchen, and enough organizational chaos to keep someone busy for a year." He paused. "I'm offering 3 months. Fair wages. I'll state the number when you tell me what fair means to you. Your own space. No obligations beyond the work itself. After 3 months, if you want to leave, I'll personally arrange transportation to wherever you want to go." Meredith studied him. She had spent years reading contracts and the people who wrote them. She was looking for the catch. "Why are you offering this to a woman you just watched get humiliated on a train platform?" "Because," Silas said without any particular drama, "a woman who tells Harold Fenwick to keep his money while she's got nowhere to sleep tonight is the kind of person I actually want running my household." She said nothing for a moment. "What's your name?" she asked. "Silas Blackridge." She recognized the name. There had been a mention of Blackridge Ranch in one of Harold Fenwick's letters, some context about the territory's cattle operations. She couldn't remember the details, but the name was real, which was something. "The wages," she said. "I'll need to hear the number." He told her. It was fair, more than fair, actually. It was the kind of number a man named before she had any leverage, which told her something about him. "All right," Meredith said, "but I want it in writing." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I'll have a paper in the wagon." They walked to his wagon in silence, and Meredith Rowan climbed up onto the seat beside a man she'd known for 4 minutes, because she had $6 in her boot and a broken brass clasp on her bag, and more pride than sense, and because the alternative was Harold Fenwick's coins scattered on a platform she never wanted to look at again. She didn't know, as the wagon rolled out of Iron Hollow into the long, flat stretch of Montana grassland, that the humiliation on that platform had not been coincidence. She didn't know that the man she'd just refused had a connection to a scheme that had been running for almost 2 years. She didn't know that she was riding directly toward the epicenter of something far more dangerous than a failed arranged marriage. She just knew the wind coming off the mountains had a cold edge to it, and that she was glad she'd kept her good wool coat. The road to Blackridge Ranch took nearly an hour and a half. Silas didn't make conversation for its own sake, which Meredith discovered she appreciated. When he did speak, it was to point out a landmark: the eastern fence line here, the creek crossing there, the tree line that marked where his land became something other than scrub grass and hope. He spoke about the ranch the way a man speaks about something he built with his hands and isn't entirely sure will survive the next season. "How long have you had it?" she asked, somewhere around the 40-minute mark. "Inherited it from my father 19 years ago," Silas said. "It was about a third the size it is now. Took 10 years to get the eastern grazing land. That's the piece that makes it viable." "What makes it not viable right now?" He glanced at her sideways. "What makes you think it's not viable?" "You said the household hasn't been properly managed in 8 months. That doesn't usually happen on a ranch that's thriving. People let things slide when they're overwhelmed with a different problem." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon wheels found a rut, and both of them absorbed the jolt without comment. "The cattle numbers have been off," he said finally. "I've had 2 fence breaks I can't fully explain. I'm paying invoices that seem higher than they should be. And my last housekeeper left without notice in February, which, I've since learned, wasn't entirely her own decision." Meredith filed that away. "Someone encouraged her to leave?" "Someone paid her to leave is what I think now. I didn't think it at the time." She looked at him. "Have you talked to anyone about this?" "I've talked to myself about it quite a bit," he said. "So far, I'm the most useless person I've found on the subject." She almost smiled. She caught it before it became visible. When Blackridge Ranch came into view, the main house, the bunkhouse, the barn, the weather vane that had gotten itself turned wrong and nobody had fixed it, Meredith felt something unexpected. Not comfort exactly, more like recognition, like looking at something that had been neglected not out of cruelty but out of exhaustion, and understanding instinctively what it would take to bring it back. The first person she met was a ranch hand named Cal, who was about 19 and had the look of someone who had been eating poorly for months. He stared at her like she might be a mirage. "This is Miss Rowan," Silas said. "She'll be managing the household." Cal looked at her bag. He looked at her face. He said with enormous sincerity, "Can you make biscuits?" "Yes," Meredith said. "Real biscuits? Not the kind that are biscuit-shaped?" "Yes," she said again. Cal turned to Silas. "She can stay," he said, and walked away. Silas watched him go. That's approximately the highest endorsement Cal has given anyone in 3 years. The cook's quarters turned out to be small and cold and in need of a thorough cleaning. The wood stove worked. There was a window that looked out toward the eastern fence line, which Meredith would later come to think of as the most important window on the property. There was a cot, a table, a chair, and a hook on the wall for her coat. She hung her coat on it. She sat on the cot. She breathed. Then she got up and found the kitchen, because she had 7 men to feed by supper, and she had never in her life solved a problem by sitting down. The kitchen was exactly as bad as she'd expected. The pantry inventory was chaos. Half-labeled tins, things pushed to the back and forgotten for months, flour that had gotten damp and needed to be assessed tin by tin. The firebox on the main stove needed cleaning. There was a pot hanging on the far wall that had something in it she chose not to examine too closely and simply moved outside. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. By supper, she had produced something that could fairly be called a meal. Not a feast, not impressive, but actual food, seasoned, hot, made with attention. The 7 ranch hands sat down at the long table and were briefly silent in the way that people are silent when something exceeds their expectations. Then Cal said, "These are real biscuits." "Yes," Meredith said, "they are." "I didn't think she was lying," he said to no one in particular. "I just wasn't sure." One of the older hands, a quiet man named Everett, who Meredith would learn had been with the ranch for 11 years, looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You staying a while?" he asked. 3 months, she said. "That's what we've agreed." Everett nodded slowly. He looked at his plate. He looked back at her. "Might be enough time," he said. She didn't know what he meant by that. She would. Silas appeared for supper late. He'd been out on the north field dealing with something, and sat at the head of the table without ceremony. He ate 2 servings without comment, which she took as approval. When the others had drifted out, he stayed. "What happened to the previous housekeeper?" Meredith asked. She'd been thinking about it since the wagon ride. Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was a habit she'd notice him repeating in the weeks ahead whenever he was deciding how much to say. Her name was Agnes. She'd been here 6 years. Someone came to see her in late January. A man from town, she said, though she wouldn't say which one. She packed up within a week and left a note saying she'd had a family emergency. Did she? She didn't have family, not living. Meredith was quiet for a moment. And you didn't investigate further. "I was trying to keep the ranch from falling behind on spring cattle work," he said. "I told myself I'd figure it out later." Later became 8 months. Later became 8 months, he agreed. He looked at her then with something that wasn't quite an apology. "I should tell you that what happened today, what Fenwick did on that platform, word will get around before Monday. People in Iron Hollow talk." "I know," she said. "Let them." He looked faintly surprised. "I haven't done anything to be ashamed of," she said. "And people who are embarrassed by proxy have always confused me." Silas was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup once more. "If anyone in town gives you trouble about it, Mr. Blackridge," she said, "I managed a law office through 3 contentious estate disputes and a municipal fraud case. I can handle gossip." He looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. He said good night. He went out. The kitchen was quiet around the warmth of the stove, and Meredith sat for a few minutes alone with the very small, carefully guarded knowledge that this place, this cold, neglected, struggling ranch at the edge of nowhere, had already begun to feel like somewhere she might be able to breathe. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. She washed the last of the dishes, banked the stove, and went to bed. 12 miles away, in a house significantly larger and significantly less honest than Blackridge Ranch, a man named Gideon Mercer was reading a letter from Harold Fenwick. The letter was short. It said the woman had been dealt with. It said she'd been humiliated publicly and would almost certainly leave Iron Hollow within the week. Gideon set the letter down. He looked out the window toward the east, toward the dark outline of grazing land that wasn't his yet, but had been promised to him by a scheme that had been running quietly for nearly 2 years. He didn't know about Silas's offer at the train station. He didn't know that Meredith Rowan was 12 miles east, in a cook's quarters, with a wood stove and a window that looked out at his fence line. He picked up his pen and wrote a short reply to Harold Fenwick. "Good," he wrote. "Keep watching the ranch. The spring filings will complete the eastern boundary claim. We're almost done." He sealed it. He went to bed. He slept without difficulty because men like Gideon Mercer had learned long ago to mistake confidence for peace of mind. He would regret that particular mistake before spring arrived. The second week, Meredith stopped counting the problems and started mapping them. That was how her father had taught her to handle a case that looked too big to touch. Not by staring at the whole of it, which only made a person feel small, but by finding one thread and following it until it connected to another. Edmund Rowan had built an entire law practice on that principle, and Meredith had watched him do it from the age of 12, sitting on a stool in the corner of his office while he worked through documents the way a surgeon worked through a patient, carefully, without flinching, with the understanding that what you found might be worse than what you expected. She hadn't planned to apply that method to Blackridge Ranch's household ledgers. She'd gone looking for the flour inventory records. The cook's pantry had a shelf of household notebooks going back 4 years. Agnes had been meticulous in her own way, columns of figures for weekly supplies, feed costs, kitchen expenditures, repair materials, Meredith had started pulling them down on a Tuesday morning, intending only to understand what the ranch had been spending on food so she could plan the coming month without wasting money. She'd spent 3 years managing a law office budget. She knew how to read a supply ledger. What she found in the third notebook stopped her cold. It wasn't dramatic the way these things never are when they first appear. It was a small thing, a payment recorded in Agnes's handwriting for a delivery of lamp oil, quantity listed as 40 gallons, price listed as $40. Meredith had written down that number without thinking, moved on 2 pages, and found another lamp oil delivery. Same supplier, same quantity listed, different price, $52. $12 difference for the same 40 gallons. She flipped back. Found a third delivery, 6 weeks before the second. 40 gallons. $38. She sat with those 3 numbers for a moment. Prices moved. She understood that. Supply routes were unpredictable, and Montana was not a place where anything arrived cheaply or reliably. A $12 swing over the course of 4 months could be nothing more than a hard winter on the supply roads. But something in the back of her mind, the same part that had caught Harold Fenwick's expression on the platform before she'd consciously processed it, said, "Keep looking." She kept looking. By noon, she had moved from the kitchen table to the floor because she needed more space. By 2 o'clock, she had sent Cal to the barn with instructions to tell anyone who came looking for her that she was occupied with household inventory and would be available at supper. By 4 o'clock, she had 4 years of household ledgers arranged in chronological order along the wall, and was working through them with the systematic focus that had once allowed her to reconstruct 3 years of a dead man's financial dealings for a Dayton estate dispute. The pattern took shape slowly, the way a face appears in a fog, one feature at a time, until suddenly you see it whole and wonder how you missed it. It started with the price discrepancies. Small ones at first, scattered through the older ledgers, easy to mistake for normal market variation. But as she moved forward in time, closer to the present, the discrepancies grew larger and more frequent. Feed supplier invoices that didn't quite match the quantities recorded in the barn log. Repair materials billed in amounts that exceeded what Everett's maintenance notes showed being used. A pattern of deliveries that were recorded as received, but that, when she checked against Cal's offhand comments about what was actually in the storage barn, didn't seem to exist in physical form. She was still sitting on the floor with papers around her when she heard boots on the porch. Silas pushed the door open without knocking. It was his house, after all, and stopped when he saw her. "I thought you were doing inventory," he said. "I am," Meredith said without looking up. "Sit down." He sat, but not before he spent a moment surveying the papers arranged across his kitchen floor with the expression of a man who cannot decide whether he's looking at a solution or a new problem. "Miss Rowan, when did you change your lamp oil supplier?" she asked. "I didn't." "Then why are you paying Hendrick's Supply Company $14 more per delivery than you were 8 months ago for the same recorded quantity?" Silence. "The invoices are in the office files," she said. "I haven't touched those yet. But the household ledgers, the ones Agnes kept, record the deliveries and prices, and what I'm seeing doesn't hold together." She finally looked up at him. "Either the prices have genuinely increased by 30% across nearly every category of supplies you purchase, which is possible but would require explaining, or someone has been adjusting the invoices before they reach you." Silas had gone very still. "How long?" he said. "In the household accounts, at least 14 months. Possibly longer, but the pattern becomes clear at 14 months. She paused. "This is just the household side. I haven't looked at your cattle or land records." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him process it, not with shock exactly, more with the grim recognition of a man who has felt something wrong under his feet for months and has just been shown the exact spot. "Bring me the office ledgers," he said. "Not yet," Meredith said. "First, I want to finish mapping what's in these. If I go to the office records now, I'll lose the thread." He looked at her. "That's my ranch's financial records you're sitting in the middle of." "Yes," she said. "And in about 2 more hours, I'll be able to tell you precisely how much of your money has left this ranch without your knowledge. You can tell me to stop right now, and I'll put everything back exactly as I found it, or you can let me finish." He looked at the papers. He looked at her. "Do you want coffee?" he said. "Please," she said, and went back to work. He made the coffee himself. She heard him moving around the kitchen behind her, Heard the small curse when he couldn't find the coffee tin she'd moved to a more logical position yesterday, heard him locate it without asking, and set a cup on the floor near her right hand without disturbing the papers. That small act of courtesy, the careful way he placed it where she could reach it without shifting her work, lodged somewhere in her awareness and stayed there. By 6 o'clock, she had a number. She didn't say it right away. She double-checked it because she had learned from her father that the first number you arrive at is often wrong in the details, even when it's right in the general magnitude. She rechecked 3 of the largest discrepancies individually. The number held. "Silas," she said. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table for the last hour, going through the office files she'd asked him to pull, saying nothing, his jaw progressively tighter. He looked up. "In the household accounts alone, over the last 14 months, I'm estimating somewhere between $400 and $460 in overpayments that don't correspond to any increase in actual supplies received." She kept her voice level. "That's a conservative estimate." He set down the paper he was holding. $400. "Conservative," she said again. "If the pattern holds in your cattle supply and equipment records, and from what you're looking at, does it?" His mouth pressed into a line. "Yes." "Then we're likely looking at a significantly larger number." She looked at him steadily. "This isn't Agnes skimming. The amounts are too large and too structured for that. Someone with access to your supplier accounts has been systematically inflating invoices and taking the difference. The question is whether the suppliers themselves are involved or whether they're being forged. How do I find that out? You write to the suppliers directly, not through your normal channels, directly to whoever owns each company, asking for confirmation of the original invoice amounts. You compare what they confirm against what you've been paying." She paused. "But before you do that, I'd suggest you do it very quietly, because if someone is running this scheme, they have a reason for wanting you financially weakened, and they may be watching whether you notice." Silas stood up from the table. He walked to the window, the one that looked toward the eastern fence line, the same direction her own window faced, and stood there for a moment. "Gideon Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Who is Gideon Mercer?" "He's a cattle baron about 30 miles northwest of here. He's been interested in my eastern grazing land for about 3 years. Silas's voice was completely flat, which was somehow worse than anger. "He's made 2 formal offers. Both times I said no. Both times he was very polite about it." "And after the second refusal?" "The fence break started, the invoice irregularities, Agnes leaving." He turned from the window. "I told myself I was being paranoid." "You weren't," Meredith said. He looked at her across the kitchen, across the papers still spread across his floor. "You found this in one afternoon," he said. "I was looking for flour inventory," she said. "I wasn't looking for this." "But you saw it." "I saw numbers that didn't add up. That's not a special skill, that's just arithmetic and paying attention." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement but in something else. "Agnes was here for 6 years. She was sharp. She knew these accounts better than I did. How did she miss it?" Meredith was quiet for a moment. She chose her next words carefully. "When did the discrepancies start appearing relative to when she left?" Silas thought about it. "They'd have started, if your 14 months is right, about 2 months before she was paid to go." "So Agnes may not have been paid to leave because she was a threat," Meredith said. "She may have been paid to leave because she was about to become one. She was close to seeing it." The silence in the kitchen had a different quality after that. "I need to see the land survey records," Meredith said. "The ones for your eastern boundary." "That'll be in the county registry office. I have copies in the study." He paused. "Why?" "Because if someone is draining your finances, and they've been at it for 14 months, they're not doing it for the money alone. $400 or $500 is not worth this level of organization for a man like Mercer. They're doing it to manufacture a pressure point, to put you in a position where you either have to sell something or can't defend a legal challenge." She stood up from the floor, straightening with some difficulty because her knees had gone stiff from sitting on the cold boards. "The eastern grazing land is worth considerably more than what they've taken from you, isn't it?" 10 times more, Silas said. "Then that's what this is about. The invoice fraud is just the mechanism. The land is the objective." She looked at him. "Do you have an attorney you trust?" "There's a man in Helena, Thomas Aldridge. He handled the deed transfer when I extended the eastern boundary." "Not anyone in Iron Hollow?" Something crossed Silas's face. The Iron Hollow attorney is a man named Prentice. He's handled some of my routine documents. He stopped. But? He and Harold Fenwick are on the same lodge committee. He said it like a man realizing something out loud that he should have paid more attention to sooner. They have dinner together twice a month. Meredith filed that away very carefully. Write to Thomas Aldridge and Helena, she said. Don't use the regular post writer. Send Cal or Everett personally, someone you absolutely trust, with a private letter. Don't say what it's about in the letter itself. Just ask him to come as soon as he can manage it on a personal matter of some urgency. Don't write Mercer's name anywhere in that letter. Silas studied her. You've done this before. I helped my father manage the documentation for a municipal fraud case in Dayton, she said. The attorney involved made the mistake of discussing the case through regular channels before he'd secured the evidence. The man they were investigating found out. 2 witnesses changed their testimony, and 3 years of work unraveled in a week. She picked up her empty coffee cup and set it on the table. You don't announce that you've found the leak until you can also stop it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Miss Rowan, I hired you to manage my household. I'm aware. This is considerably outside the scope of that. Do you want me to stop? He looked at the papers on the floor. He looked at her. No, he said. The next 10 days were ordinary on the surface and entirely not ordinary underneath. Meredith ran the household. She organized the pantry, planned the meals, got the kitchen running with the kind of efficiency that came from having spent years keeping a small office functional on a limited budget. The ranch hands ate better. Cal gained what looked like 4 pounds and became her most devoted ally. Everett, who said little and observed everything, began leaving small helpful notes on the kitchen table. The south barn door's hinge needs oil, the root cellar latch is sticking, as though he was quietly volunteering information to someone he'd decided to trust. She found time in the early mornings, before the house was fully awake, to continue working through the financial records. What she found in the land documents was worse than the invoice fraud. The eastern boundary of Black Ridge Ranch had been established by survey in 1876. Silas had extended it legally in 1879, with Thomas Aldridge managing the deed transfer. The copies in Silas's study were clear, dated, properly witnessed. But when she compared the boundary descriptions in those documents against a newer survey map, she found filed among a stack of papers in the back of the office drawer, a map she would have missed entirely if she hadn't been looking for a specific measurement notation. The eastern line had moved, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough. About 60 yards along the creek boundary that defined the northeast corner. 60 yards didn't sound like much until you understood that the creek was the water access point for the entire eastern grazing section. Without legal water access, the eastern land became substantially less valuable. And if the boundary had been redrawn to place that water access in question, any legal challenge to Black Ridge's land claim would start from an already weakened position. She sat in the early morning dark with that map and felt something cold move through her that wasn't from the temperature. She brought it to Silas after breakfast, when the hands had gone to their work and the kitchen was quiet. She put both maps on the table side by side and pointed to the northeast corner. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. That's not my boundary, he said finally. His voice was quiet in the way that's quieter than angry. No. The 1879 deed description puts the creek line here, she pointed, which gives you clear water access across the northeast corner. This newer survey moves the line here, which puts approximately half your creek access outside your recorded boundary. Where did this map come from? Your office. Bottom drawer, behind about 2 years of feed supply receipts. Someone left it there, which means either they intended you to find it eventually, perhaps as a shock when a legal challenge arrived, or they intended to retrieve it and forgot. Or they put it there knowing I'd never clean out that drawer. Possibly, she said. Silas, who has had access to this office in the last 18 months? He rubbed the back of his neck. It was the first genuinely tired gesture she'd seen from him. Ranch hands come in and out for payroll. Agnes had access. My supply merchants come through when I'm reviewing invoices with them. Usually I bring them in here. He stopped. Prentice came out about 7 months ago. Said it was a routine land record verification for the county. He said it slowly, feeling the weight of it. I left him in here while I went to deal with a problem at the barn. Meredith looked at him. He was alone in here for about 40 minutes, Silas said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. All right, Meredith said, here's what I think we need to do. She had started saying we somewhere in the second week, and neither of them had acknowledged it or stopped it from happening. Write to Aldridge today. Send Everett. He's the one who's been here longest and won't talk. Tell Aldridge you need a survey expert and a document specialist when he comes, and tell him to bring original county registry copies of your 1879 deed transfer, not whatever the county clerk's office in Iron Hollow currently has on file. She paused. Because if Prentice is involved, the Iron Hollow records may have already been altered. Silas looked at her steadily. You're saying I might be fighting a land claim that's already been built into the official record. I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying we need to know before they move, not after. She held his gaze. How long do you think you have? Before Mercer makes his move, whatever that looks like. He thought about it. Spring, the grazing season. If he's going to make a legal challenge to the eastern boundary, he'd want to do it before I move cattle onto that land, because a land claim gets complicated when there are animals already on it. And he knows I know that, he calculated. 4 months, maybe 5. Then we have 4 months to build a case that doesn't depend on Iron Hollow's records, Meredith said. That documents the invoice fraud, the forged survey, and the connection between Mercer and whoever in this chain has been doing his work for him. She picked up the newer map, the forged one, she was certain of it now, and placed it carefully on top of the original. I'll need copies of everything before we send the originals to Aldridge, she said, and I'll need access to your full financial records, not just the household accounts. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Miss Rowan. Yes. When I offered you work 3 months ago, I said fair wages. You did. I didn't factor in the possibility that you were going to save my ranch. She looked at him very directly. I'm going to try to help you save your ranch, she said. That's different. Don't put the outcome on me before we know what the outcome is. It's bad luck, and it's bad logic. The corner of his mouth moved. My grandfather said something like that once. Your grandfather sounds like he had good sense. He also lost a cattle herd to a blizzard he was certain wasn't coming, Silas said. So his track record was mixed. It was the first time she'd heard him make anything like a joke, and it caught her off guard enough that she actually smiled, briefly, before she caught it, but he saw it. He didn't comment on it. Everett left for Helena the following morning before sunrise, carrying a letter sealed with Silas's personal mark and tucked inside his coat, with instructions to ride to the next town before stopping and to speak to nobody about his destination. I was a man of very few words and had not, in Meredith's observation, asked a single unnecessary question in the 2 weeks she'd known him. He simply nodded, mounted up, and rode out in the dark. She watched him go from the cook's quarters window and then went back to her work. The response came back in 8 days. Thomas Aldridge would arrive within the fortnight. He was bringing a colleague who specialized in land registry disputes. His letter was brief and careful, which told her he understood immediately what kind of communication this needed to be. In the meantime, the ranch ran. It ran better than it had in months, if Cal and Everett were to be believed. And Cal was incapable of telling a comfortable lie, and Everett had no interest in telling any kind at all. The meals were regular. The supplies were organized. Meredith had begun a fresh supply ledger, recording every delivery with what she considered standard legal record precision: quantity, price, supplier, received by whom, cross-referenced against what was actually in the storage barn the following day. If anyone was still trying to inflate invoices, they would find that significantly more difficult now, because she checked every single one. 3 suppliers in the first 2 weeks sent invoices that didn't match what had been delivered. She wrote to each one directly, citing the specific discrepancy, requesting a corrected invoice, and keeping copies of her own letters. 2 of them sent corrections without comment. The third sent a man. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, riding in on a good horse and wearing a coat that was too expensive for a supply merchant's representative. He asked for Mr. Blackridge. Silas was in the north field, and Meredith was the one who met him on the porch. I'm managing the household accounts, she said pleasantly. Can I help you? He looked at her in the way men looked at her when they expected someone who could be handled and were recalibrating. The invoice matter is really something I need to discuss with Mr. Blackridge directly. Of course, Meredith said. He'll be back this evening. You're welcome to wait. In the meantime, perhaps you can help me understand the discrepancy. The invoice records a delivery of 60 pounds of mixed grain at $12, but the barn log shows only 40 pounds received. If you have a record of the actual delivery quantity, that would help clarify things considerably. He smiled. It didn't reach anything above his jawline. There may have been a clerical error on our end. Easily resolved then, Meredith said. I'll just need the corrected receipt and confirmation of the actual delivered weight, signed by your company's principal. We're keeping very thorough records this season. She smiled back with equal warmth and equal emptiness. Thorough records are really the best protection for everyone, aren't they? He left within the hour without waiting for Silas, which was exactly what she'd expected. When Silas came in that evening, she told him about it. He listened without interrupting. Kendrick Supplies, she said. That's the company. I'd add them to your letter to Aldridge. Ask him to check whether there's a documented relationship between Kendrick Supplies and any business associated with Mercer. Silas had been washing his hands at the basin. He stopped. You think Mercer owns them? I think it's worth asking, she said. A supply company willing to adjust invoices on request is either corrupt generally or corrupt specifically. If it's specific, if someone is directing them, that's a much cleaner form of evidence than trying to prove intent from financial records alone. He dried his hands. He leaned against the kitchen door frame and looked at her in the particular way he'd started looking at her over the last 2 weeks. Not the way a man looks at a woman exactly, but the way a person looks at another person they've begun to regard as genuinely indispensable and aren't quite sure what to do with that. Can I ask you something? He said. You can try. When you were in Dayton, before you answered the advertisement, what was it actually like? She hadn't expected that question. She set down the spoon she was holding. What do you mean? I mean, you had experience. You clearly had skill. You weren't without resources, at least not immediately. What made you answer an advertisement for a marriage in Montana? Meredith was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stove, which was the easiest direction to look when she didn't want someone reading her face. The practice closed when my father died, she said. I tried to find work. What I found consistently was that the people who needed what I could offer were not willing to pay a woman to offer it. I tried for 9 months. She paused. I had one conversation with a very senior attorney in Cincinnati where he told me, genuinely trying to be helpful, that I should find a position as a school teacher, that I was, and these were his actual words, wasting my abilities in a field where my abilities would never be recognized. What did you say to him? I thanked him for his time and left. She turned back to the stove. What could I say? He was right that they wouldn't recognize it. He was wrong that the answer was to find less to do. Silas was quiet for a moment. The advertisement. The advertisement said capable woman preferred, she said, which I was. It said practical and willing to work, which I also was. It described a situation where my actual skills might be relevant. She picked up the spoon again. It seemed like better odds than Cincinnati. And then Fenwick. And then Fenwick, she agreed without particular heat. I'm sorry that happened, Silas said. Not the way men say it when they feel obligated, but the way a person says it when they mean it and don't know a better way to convey the weight of that meaning. Don't be, Meredith said. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here. And if I weren't here, you might have made it to spring without knowing what was sitting in your bottom drawer and what was happening to your invoices. She looked at him over her shoulder. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the thing that puts you exactly where you needed to be. I've stopped trying to make sense of that. He looked at her for a long moment. He said goodnight. He left. She stood at the stove and listened to his boots on the floorboards across the main hall, fading into the part of the house that was his. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to think about the way he'd said, I'm sorry. She was going to think about the Kendrick Supplies invoice and the forged survey map, and Thomas Aldridge arriving within the fortnight, and the 4 months they had before spring. She thought about Silas Blackridge saying, I'm sorry in that particular tone for approximately 3 more minutes before she was able to redirect herself successfully. Then she banked the stove, checked the locks on the kitchen door, and went to her room. 3 days later, she found the second forged document. It was filed, almost invisible, inside the pages of a completely mundane cattle sales ledger from the previous year. A single sheet, not in Agnes's handwriting, not in Silas's, not in any hand she recognized. It appeared to be a correspondence record of a meeting between Silas Blackridge and a county land assessor, agreeing to a voluntary boundary adjustment on the northeast corner. Silas Blackridge's signature was on it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went to find Silas, because that signature was not his. She had been reading his handwriting for 3 weeks, and she was absolutely certain. And because whoever had made it was skilled enough that it would take a document specialist to prove what she already knew. And because the people they were dealing with had just shown her how far they were actually willing to go. Silas looked at the forged signature for a long time without speaking. Meredith watched him look at it. She had learned in the weeks since she'd arrived that his silences were not the silences of a man who had nothing to say, but of a man who was deciding what was worth saying. There was a difference, and she'd come to recognize it the way you recognize a change in the weather. Not from any single sign, but from the accumulated weight of small things. "That's not my hand," he said finally. "I know. It's close." "It's very close," she agreed. "Someone studied your signature carefully. If you look at the capital B in Blackridge, the loop is slightly too rounded. Your B is more angular, more compressed. And the cross on the lowercase t in Silas runs a little long here, where yours is short and almost impatient." She set the document on the table beside 2 receipts she'd pulled from the payroll file, both bearing Silas's genuine signature. Side by side, it's visible, alone, on an official correspondence record buried in a cattle ledger. Most people would never question it. He looked at the comparison she'd laid out. His jaw was doing the tight thing it did when he was working very hard not to show what he was feeling. "This is a document stating I voluntarily agreed to a boundary adjustment." "Yes." "Which means if Mercer files a legal challenge to the eastern boundary in spring, he doesn't have to prove the boundary is wrong. He just has to produce this and claim I already acknowledged it myself." "That's what I think it's designed to do." "Yes." Silas pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window. That same window, the one that faced east, and she could see the tension across his shoulders from across the room. "Prentice," he said. The name came out flat. "He had access to your signature on the documents he handled. He was alone in your office for 40 minutes. Meredith paused. "But we cannot name Prentice to anyone until Aldridge is here and we have a document specialist's formal assessment. If we accuse him without proof and we're wrong, we've alerted Mercer that we're looking. If we're right and we move too soon, we give them time to make this document disappear and produce something worse." Silas turned from the window. "How do you stay this calm?" "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm organized. There's a difference." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite something else. He came back to the table and looked at the forged document again. "Where did you find it?" "The cattle sales ledger from last year. 3rd shelf of the office, the one with the green cover. It was folded inside the back pages." She paused. "I almost didn't check it. I was looking for the quarterly cattle count records that should be adjacent to it on the shelf, and the green ledger was in the wrong position, shifted about 2 inches forward. It may have been replaced in a hurry." "Someone came back for it and couldn't find it in the dark," Silas said, "or got interrupted." "That's what I think." He put his hand flat on the table, not on the document itself, but next to it, as if he needed to feel something solid. "This has been going on for 2 years," he said. "Right here. In this house. In that office." He said it quietly, and the quietness of it said everything about how much it cost him. Meredith understood that particular feeling, the specific violation of realizing that your own familiar space had been used against you. It was worse than if it had happened somewhere else. "I know," she said. Not as comfort, as acknowledgement. He straightened. "I'll write to Aldridge tonight. Tell him about the document. Don't describe it in the letter. Just tell him the matter has become more urgent and ask him to come as quickly as possible." She picked up the forged document carefully, holding it only at the edge. "I'm going to wrap this separately from the other copies. It needs to go to Helena in Aldridge's hands, not through any local channel." "Agreed." He watched her handle the document. "Meredith." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed it and kept her face even. "Yes. If Aldridge comes and confirms what we think this is, what comes next, legally? Then we have evidence of forgery, which is a criminal matter separate from the land dispute. We have evidence of financial fraud through the invoice manipulation. We have a pattern that, taken together, establishes the conspiracy rather than just the individual acts." She set the document down. "The land claim itself, If we can prove the survey map was altered and the county registry records were tampered with, that becomes a case for the territorial court. It's not fast, but it's definitive. Months, he said. Probably, yes. He was quiet. Outside, she could hear Cal crossing the yard, the distant sound of the barn door. The ranch's ordinary sounds, moving around a situation that was anything but ordinary. You said the invoice fraud is a separate criminal matter, Silas said. That means Mercer may not be directly named in it. He'd use people between himself and the actual acts. Yes, men like Mercer always do. She looked at him. Which is why we need to establish the chain. Kendrick supplies to whoever directs them. Prentice to whoever hired him. The forged signature to whoever had access and motive. If we can connect enough of those chains to a single source, then the source can't claim ignorance. Exactly. Silas nodded slowly. There was something different in his face now. Not just the grimness that had been there since she'd shown him the document, but something underneath it, a kind of settling, like a man who has been fighting shadows for 2 years and has finally been handed a lamp. What do you need from me? He said. The question was simple, and it meant everything, because it was the question of a man who had decided to stop being the only one carrying the weight of something. I need you to act normally, she said. Go to town when you normally go. Don't avoid Prentice. That will signal something has changed. Don't change your supply orders yet. Don't do anything that tells them we found what they left in that office. And while I'm acting normally, I'm going to finish going through every piece of paper in this house, Meredith said. Every ledger, every file, every letter that's been kept. Because if they put one forged document in there, there may be others, and I want to know exactly what we're dealing with before Aldridge arrives. She worked for 5 days. She went through the office systematically, shelf by shelf, working in the early mornings before the household woke, and in the evenings after supper was cleared. She found 3 more anomalies, not as dramatic as the forged signature, but significant. A letter of complaint from a neighboring ranch owner about a fence line dispute that should have been filed and appeared never to have been forwarded to Silas. A survey notation in pencil on an otherwise clean plat map that didn't match the recorded description, and a payment record for a service Meredith could find no corresponding work for anywhere in the ranch's activity log. She documented each one. She made copies in her own hand. She noted dates, locations found, condition. She also, on the 3rd day, sat on the floor of the office at 6 in the morning and had about 4 minutes of feeling completely overwhelmed before she collected herself and went back to work. She didn't mention this to anyone. It wasn't relevant information. Thomas Aldridge arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after Everett had ridden to Helena. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a thin beard that could not fully commit to being a beard and a set of eyes that moved quickly over everything in a room before settling anywhere. He had a younger man with him, introduced as Gerard Holt, who dealt in document authentication and had previously worked for the Territorial Land Registry Office before entering private practice. They arrived in the late afternoon. Meredith had supper ready, which was her standard operating approach to any situation. Deal with the immediate needs first, business second. Aldridge seemed to appreciate it. Holt ate with the focused silence of a man who understood he was here to work. After supper, with the hands gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen quiet, Meredith spread everything across the kitchen table. She had organized it chronologically and by category, with her own notes attached to each item, explaining where it had been found and what she believed it indicated. She had learned from watching her father that a good attorney didn't want to be told what to think. He wanted the evidence organized well enough that he could think clearly himself. Aldridge went through it without speaking for nearly 40 minutes. Holt went directly to the forged signature document and stayed there, bending close to it, tilting it toward the lamp, producing a small magnifying glass from his coat pocket without comment. Silas sat at the far end of the table and watched both of them. His hands were flat on the table. He had the particular stillness of a man who has said everything he can say and is waiting on other people now. Meredith stood near the stove with a fresh pot of coffee because she didn't know where else to stand, and keeping her hands occupied kept her from showing how much she wanted Aldridge to look up and say what she needed him to say. Finally, Aldridge looked up. He looked at Meredith first. You compiled all of this? Yes. You were managing the household accounts. I was, she said. The household accounts were where I started. The rest followed from there. Aldridge looked at Silas. Where did you find her? Train platform, Silas said. Aldridge absorbed this without visible reaction, which was the mark of a man who had practiced law long enough that nothing genuinely surprised him. He looked back at Meredith. Your methodology is sound. Your documentation is excellent. Your notes are clear, and your organization is significantly better than most of what I receive from professional clerks. He set down the page he was holding. I have some questions. Of course, she said. The invoice discrepancies. You've cross-referenced household records against what was physically present in storage. Yes. I conducted a physical inventory in the first week and have been maintaining a daily receipt log since. I also have 3 instances of invoice corrections requested and received, and 1 instance where a supplier's representative came in person rather than correcting in writing. Which supplier? Kendrick Supplies. I have notes from that conversation and the original invoice and my correction request, all dated. Aldridge made a note. He looked at Silas. Kendrick Supplies is registered in the county records as belonging to a man named Durant, but the original registration paperwork lists a silent partner. He paused deliberately. The name on the silent partnership agreement is Wallace Mercer, Gideon Mercer's older brother. The kitchen was very quiet. So the supply fraud was directed, Silas said. It appears that way, yes. Which means we can establish that the financial damage done to this ranch was not opportunistic but targeted. Aldridge turned to Holt. The document? Holt straightened. He was holding the forged signature page very carefully by its edges. This is a skilled forgery, he said. He had a precise, unshowy way of speaking that Meredith immediately respected. Whoever did this had access to multiple genuine samples of Mr. Blackridge's signature and took time with it. But there are 3 characteristics that mark it as forged. The ink composition is different. I'll need a controlled comparison to confirm, but it appears to be a different grade entirely from what Mr. Blackridge would routinely have had available in a ranch office. The pressure pattern of the pen is wrong in the cross-strokes, and the paper is slightly newer than the date written on the document. You can see it in the edge color here, where authentic documents from this period would show a certain degree of yellowing. Can you confirm all of that formally? Meredith asked. With the right equipment, yes. I'll need to take this to Helena. I'll have written findings within 10 days. He looked at her. You said this was found inside a cattle ledger on the office shelf? Yes. 3rd shelf, inside the back pages of the green cover ledger dated last year. And the ledger itself is genuine? The ledger is Agnes's handwriting throughout and matches her style consistently in the earlier volumes. Only the inserted document is anomalous. Holt nodded. He set the document in a flat case he'd brought for the purpose. I'll keep this in my possession from this point. Aldridge looked at Silas. I need to tell you that what we have is strong. It is not yet complete. We have evidence of financial fraud through the supply chain. We have a forged document. We have an altered survey map that will require an independent land survey to formally challenge. He paused. We also have what I suspect is a compromised county registry office in Iron Hollow, which means I'll be filing directly with the territorial court in Helena to establish our record before anything goes through local channels. Prentice, Silas said. Possibly. I'll need to be careful about naming him specifically until we have documentary evidence of his participation rather than circumstantial. Aldridge looked at Meredith. The letter of complaint you found, the one about the fence dispute that was never forwarded to Mr. Blackridge, was it addressed to Prentice's office? It was addressed to the Iron Hollow legal office. Prentice is the only attorney there. Then it was his obligation to forward it, and he didn't. Aldridge made another note. That's not forgery, but it's dereliction that establishes a pattern of working against his client's interest. Silas said, He's not my attorney. I only used him for routine documents, which he then had access to, including your signature. Aldridge closed his notepad. Give me 6 weeks. Holt will complete the document analysis. I'll commission a new survey of the eastern boundary from a certified surveyor who has no connection to Iron Hollow. I'll pull the original deed transfer records from the Territorial Archive in Helena, not Iron Hollow, and have them compared against what's currently on file locally, and I'll investigate the Kendrick Supplies connection formally. 6 weeks takes us to December, Silas said. Yes, which is well before any spring filing deadline Mercer might have in mind. Meredith thought about something. Mr. Aldridge, when you file with the territorial court, when that becomes a matter of record, Will Mercer know? Eventually, yes. Court filings are public record. How quickly? Aldridge looked at her steadily. What are you asking? I'm asking whether Mercer will have time to respond before we've secured the evidence. Because if he becomes aware that a territorial case is being built, she stopped. He's been patient for nearly 2 years. He's been methodical. If he feels that patience is about to run out of time, he may stop being patient, Aldridge said. Yes. The room was very quiet again. Outside, the wind had picked up. Meredith could hear it moving along the roofline, the particular sound of Montana weather deciding to do something. I'll be as quiet as I can be in Helena, Aldridge said. I can't promise complete secrecy, but I can work through channels that don't run back to Mercer's contacts. He has contacts. Men like that always do. But I know the ones to avoid. He looked at Silas. In the meantime, I'm going to recommend you keep doing exactly what you're doing. Don't change your patterns. Don't confront anyone locally. And, he glanced at Meredith, keep her watching the accounts. That was already the plan, Silas said. Aldridge and Holt stayed the night and left at first light. Meredith stood on the porch and watched the wagon diminish down the long road east, and felt the particular mixture of relief and dread that comes when you have handed part of a problem to someone capable and realize that the part you're keeping is still very large. Silas came to stand beside her. They stood there for a moment in the cold morning air, not speaking. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she agreed. He went in. She stayed a moment longer, looking east toward the fence line she could see from this porch and from her window, and from the office, and from practically everywhere on this property. The fence line that was the edge of what someone else wanted badly enough to lie and forge and scheme for 2 years to take. She understood, standing there, that she was angry. Not the sharp immediate anger she'd felt on the train platform with Harold Fenwick's coins scattering at her feet. This was something slower and deeper. The anger that comes from watching something honest and hard-worked and decent be targeted by something that was none of those things. She went inside and made breakfast. The weeks that followed had a strange quality of suspended tension. The ranch operated normally on its surface. The cattle work, the supply orders, the meals and the maintenance and the rhythm of days that has its own momentum on a working ranch. Underneath, everything was building towards something none of them could fully predict. Cal noticed Meredith was quieter than usual, but had the wisdom not to comment on it directly. Instead, he took to appearing near the kitchen at odd hours with various small problems that required her attention, which she recognized as his imprecise way of keeping her company without admitting to it. She let him. She even found it useful. Everett said less than ever, which meant he was paying close attention to everything. On the 4th week, something changed. A rider came to the ranch on a Tuesday, not from the main road but from the south pasture track, which was unusual. He was young, maybe 20, riding a horse that was good quality but not obviously branded. He asked to speak to Mr. Blackridge about a grazing lease opportunity. Silas met him on the porch. Meredith happened to be near the front window, not deliberately positioned there, just present. She watched the young man's hands while he talked. He was nervous in a way that wasn't consistent with someone making a routine business inquiry. His eyes moved too much. He kept touching the brim of his hat in a repeated gesture that telegraphed anxiety rather than politeness. When Silas came inside afterward, Meredith was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't been drinking. "Well," she said, "he says he's representing a party interested in leasing the south pasture section for spring grazing." "Who's the party?" "He wouldn't give a name. Said his client preferred to remain unnamed until Mr. Blackridge had expressed preliminary interest." Meredith set her cup down. "That's not how a legitimate grazing lease inquiry works." "No," Silas said. "It isn't." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I wasn't interested in leasing anything at this time, and if his client wanted to discuss it further, he was welcome to put his name to a formal written inquiry." "Good." She paused. "Did you recognize him?" "No, he's not local." "Brought in from outside," she said, "to see how you'd respond, to see if you'd bite at something that looked like a reasonable offer but would have got you into a conversation with someone connected to Mercer." She thought about it. "He's probing, trying to find out where you are, whether you're worried enough about money to be interested in cash from a lease, which would tell him the financial pressure is working." Silas sat down across from her. Or he's trying to get me into a meeting where something can be proposed that sounds legitimate but establishes a paper trail suggesting I was negotiating to change the land arrangement voluntarily. That too, she said. She looked at him. He's getting impatient. 2 weeks before Aldridge said he'd have something. I know. She turned her cup in her hands. She hadn't noticed until this moment that she'd picked up Silas's habit of doing that when she was thinking. She set it down. We need to be careful right now, very careful. If Mercer feels the window closing, the young man with the hat is the polite version of what comes next. She was right, and she knew she was right, and she hated being right about it. What came next was not polite. It was a Thursday night, the kind of dark that settles on Montana in late autumn, like a weight, no moon and the stars obscured by cloud cover that had been building all day. Meredith had been in bed for an hour but not sleeping. She had the light sleeper's particular awareness of sound, the way her mind stayed half attentive even in rest, a habit formed from years of living alone and being responsible for her own security. She heard the horses before anyone else did. Not one horse. 3, maybe 4, moving along the south side of the property, too quiet for normal riders on a normal approach. People moving at night who don't want to be heard move differently from people who don't care, and she'd learned the difference during a difficult 2 months in Cincinnati when she'd rented a room in a building with less reputable neighbors. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she'd consciously decided to do it. She went to her window, the east-facing one, the important one, and looked out. In the dark, she could see almost nothing, just the fence line and the shadow mass of the barn. But she could hear the horses now more clearly, and she could hear something else. Voices, low and close to the eastern fence, and the particular sound of someone dismounting. She grabbed her coat. She grabbed the small pistol she'd asked Silas for at the end of her first week, and that he'd provided without asking why, which was one of the things she'd noted about him. She went out the cook's quarters side door into the cold. She could hear shouting from the north side of the property now. Silas's voice and Cal's and the sound of horses at speed. The main attack, she understood immediately, was coming from the north. The noise, the riders, the confrontation, all of it drawing attention and boots and lanterns to the north pasture, away from the east, away from the barn. She moved along the shadow of the fence line toward the barn. Her eyes had adjusted well enough to see shapes, and the shape she saw was a man. Just one, on foot now, moving toward the barn's side door with something in his hand that caught the barest available light in the way that a glass bottle catches light. She understood what she was looking at. She stopped. She planted her feet the way her father had taught her. Feet apart, body turned, both hands on the grip. Her father had been a cautious man who believed a woman living alone should know exactly what she was doing with a firearm, and he had made certain his daughter did. "Stop where you are," she said. Her voice came out steady. The man stopped. He turned. She couldn't see his face fully, but she could see he was startled, genuinely startled, in the way of someone who has been told there is no one to worry about on this side of the property. "Put it down," she said. "Whatever you're carrying, put it on the ground right now." He hesitated. "I can see you clearly," she said. This was not entirely true, but it was true enough. "And I am a great deal more comfortable with this pistol than you probably think I am." He put the bottle down, slowly, with the careful movements of someone thinking hard about their options. "Kick it away from you," she said. "To your left, toward the fence." He did. "Now sit down." "Ma'am, sit down on the ground right now or I will make a decision. I'll be very comfortable defending afterward," she said. "Your choice." He sat down. She held the pistol on him and waited, which took every bit of composure she had, because her hands were shaking in a way she could feel and was managing to prevent from being visible in the dark. She had never held a gun on another person before this moment, and the gap between knowing how to do something and actually doing it was considerably wider than she'd understood in the abstract. Silas arrived approximately 3 minutes later, at a run, with a lantern. He stopped when he saw her. He saw the man on the ground. He saw the bottle near the fence. He looked at Meredith. She lowered the pistol. Her hands, now that it was over, started shaking in earnest. She put them in her coat pockets so no one would see. "There were riders on the north pasture," she said. Her voice was completely level. She was proud of that privately, while her hands shook inside her pockets. "They were the distraction. This one was coming for the barn." Silas looked at the bottle near the fence. His face in the lantern light did the thing it did when he was feeling something very large and keeping it contained. He looked at the man on the ground. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing. Cal appeared behind Silas, then Everett, then two more hands, everyone converging with the chaotic energy of people who have just dealt with something dangerous and are still running on the afterburn of it. The North Pasture riders had fled when they'd heard shouting. Silas confirmed this in brief words, but they'd cut 2 sections of the eastern fence before leaving. Everett looked at the man on the ground. He looked at the bottle. He looked at Meredith. He said nothing, but the expression on his face said everything about what he thought of what he was looking at. Cal said, Did she just? Yes, Silas said. Cal looked at Meredith with an expression that had gone entirely beyond words. They tied the man's wrists and put him in the storage room off the barn, which had a solid lock, and Silas sent Everett to town at first light to bring the county sheriff, not Prentice, not anyone from Mercer's network, but the actual county sheriff who was headquartered in the next town over, and who Silas had enough confidence in to take the risk. Meredith went back to the kitchen. She put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands. She sat at the kitchen table and waited for the water to boil and thought about the fact that she had just held a man at gunpoint in the dark while the ranch burned around the edges of her attention, and that she had not once, not for a single moment, run inside and locked the door instead. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it for a long time. Silas came into the kitchen an hour later. He sat down across from her without being asked. She poured him coffee. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He looked at her across the table, and this time there was no managing whatever was in his face. He just let her see it. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "You could have come to get me." "There wasn't time," she said. "If he'd reached the barn with that bottle, we'd have lost the barn and everything in it, and probably the fence structure on 3 sides before anyone could contain it." "I know," he said. "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. "You've been here 7 weeks," he said. "This isn't your ranch. This isn't your fight. Nobody hired you to stand in the dark with a pistol between a man and a barn." Meredith looked at her coffee cup. She thought about what to say and landed on the truth because that was generally where she landed. "It felt like my fight," she said. "I don't know exactly when that happened, but it did." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "Meredith," he said. The same way he'd said it the first time. Not the way a man says a woman's name when he's being formal or polite or cautious, but the way he says it when the name means something specific. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't say whatever you're about to say right now," she said. "Because it's 2 in the morning and I've had a very significant hour, and I'd rather have this conversation when I'm capable of being rational about it." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not away, exactly, but sideways, into something she could only describe as respect with an edge of humor that he was just barely keeping from his mouth. "All right," he said. They sat in the kitchen with their coffee for another 20 minutes. They didn't speak. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that settles between people who have been through something together and don't need to put all of it into words right away. When she finally went back to her room, she stopped in the doorway and said, without turning around, "The man in the storage room. He's frightened. If the sheriff handles him carefully before anyone from Mercer's side gets to him, he may talk." "I know," Silas said. "I'll make sure of it." She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle back into its night sounds around the damage and the adrenaline and the 2 cut fence sections on the eastern side, and thought about the fact that someone had decided to stop being subtle. Whatever patience Gideon Mercer had been running on for 2 years had finally run out. And whatever time she and Silas had thought they had before this became something that couldn't be managed from a kitchen table with ledgers and careful letters to Helena, that time had just become considerably shorter. The man in the storage room was named Pete Collar, and he was 24 years old and had been in Gideon Mercer's employ for 8 months, and he was absolutely terrified. Meredith knew this before she ever spoke to him. She could tell from the way Everett described his behavior when he'd brought him water at first light. The way he'd taken the cup with both hands, even though they were no longer bound. The way he'd asked twice whether the sheriff had been sent for in a voice that was trying to sound indifferent and failing completely. Frightened people asked questions they already knew the answers to. It was a way of measuring how much time they had. She didn't go to the storage room herself. That was Silas's territory, and she understood the line. What she did was stand in the kitchen while Silas spoke to Pete Collar in the hour before the sheriff arrived, close enough to hear through the wall that separated the storage room from the kitchen's north corner, and she listened. Silas wasn't cruel about it. That was something she'd understood about him by now. He had a kind of direct gravity that didn't need cruelty to be effective. He simply laid out what was true, that Pete Collar had been caught on private property at night carrying what appeared to be an incendiary device, and that the men who'd hired him had ridden away and left him sitting on the ground, and that the territorial penalty for arson was not something Pete Collar wanted to find out about firsthand. Pete held out for about 12 minutes. Then he started talking. He'd been picked up in Billings, he said, by a man named Hatcher, who told him he was recruiting day riders for seasonal fence work. When he'd arrived, the work turned out to be something else. Surveillance, mostly, watching the ranch from a distance, reporting on who came and went. He'd never met Mercer directly. He'd never been told the full plan. 2 days ago, Hatcher had told him and two others what the Thursday night job was. The riders north would draw out the household while Pete went south for the barn. Hatcher, Silas said. Where is he? Pete didn't know. Hatcher came and went. He had a room at a boarding house in a town called Red Bend, about 20 miles northwest, but Pete hadn't seen him since Wednesday. Who does Hatcher report to? Pete hesitated. Son, Silas said, and his voice had the particular quiet of a man who has made up his mind about something. You are the only person who got caught last night. The men who rode north are back wherever they came from. Hatcher is in Red Bend, or he isn't. You are in my storage room. You have exactly one opportunity to be useful to the people who are about to decide what happens to you next. A long pause. Hatcher reports to a man named Voss, Pete said. Chester Voss. He's the one who manages operations. I don't think I've ever heard Mercer's name said out loud by anyone. They're careful that way. Meredith stood very still on her side of the wall. Chester Voss. She filed it. She went to the kitchen table and wrote it down, and also wrote Hatcher and Red Bend and drew the structure of what Pete had just described. Mercer at the top, then Voss, then Hatcher, then men like Pete at the bottom, who didn't even know the full shape of what they were doing. It was exactly the structure she'd predicted to Aldridge, layers between the man at the center and the acts being committed in his name. The sheriff arrived mid-morning. His name was Garrett Purcell, out of Milford, and he was a lean, unhurried man of about 50 who listened to Silas's account with no visible reaction and asked precise questions that told Meredith he was paying closer attention than his expression suggested. He interviewed Pete Collar for an hour. Then he came into the kitchen, accepted the coffee Meredith offered without comment, and sat down across from Silas. The names he gave you, Purcell said. Hatcher and Voss. I've had Voss in my county before. Dispute down in Benton Creek about 3 years ago over water rights. He was representing a land interest that ended up pulling out before it went to hearing. He turned his cup in his hands. The land interest was eventually traced back to a consortium. The consortium dissolved before anyone could establish its principles officially. Mercer, Silas said. I can't say that, Purcell said. I don't have it documented, but I'll tell you that when that Benton Creek business went away, Gideon Mercer ended up with grazing access to a section of land that had been in dispute. He looked at Silas steadily. I've been watching that man for 3 years. The problem with men like Mercer is that they don't leave fingerprints. Everyone who can put him in the room works for him and has good reasons not to talk. We have documentation, Meredith said. Purcell looked at her. He'd been aware of her since he arrived. She could tell he was the kind of man who cataloged everything in a room when he entered it. But this was the first time he'd addressed her directly. What kind of documentation, he said. Forged survey records. Forged land correspondence with Mr. Blackridge's signature. Invoice fraud running through a supply company with a documented silent ownership connection to Mercer's family. Altered county registry records, we believe. And a territorial attorney in Helena who is currently building a formal case for the territorial court. Purcell looked at her for a long moment. You've been here how long? 8 weeks. He looked at Silas. Where did you find her? Train platform, Silas said, which was becoming his standard answer to that question. Purcell drank his coffee. He set the cup down. He looked at the table for a moment in the way of a man running through calculations. If Aldridge is filing with the territorial court, and if your documentation is as solid as you're describing, Mercer is about to find out this is moving faster than he planned. He paused. which is probably why Thursday happened. He panicked, Meredith said. He escalated, Purcell corrected gently. Men like Mercer don't panic. They make a calculation that direct action has become more cost-effective than patience. He looked at Silas. Which means we have a window. The period between when he realizes his Thursday night operation failed and when he decides what to try next. We need to use it. How? Silas said. I'm going to hold Collar for now. He's not the target, but he's leverage if we need it, and having him in custody keeps him from going back and reporting exactly how much you know. Purcell stood. I'm going to ride to Red Bend and see about Hatcher. If I can connect Hatcher to Voss through any documented contact, that's another link in your chain. He put on his coat. I'd also suggest you send word to Aldridge today, telling him about Thursday. He needs to know the timetable has changed. After Purcell left, Meredith sat at the kitchen table with the ranch quiet around her. The hands were out repairing the cut fence sections, the morning's chaos settling into the particular tired stillness that follows a crisis. And she looked at the notes she'd written while listening through the wall, and she thought. The structure she was looking at was bigger than she'd originally mapped. Invoice fraud, forged documents, compromised local legal channels, organized writers, a management layer in Voss, operational cover through men like Hatcher. This wasn't just a land grab with some paperwork fraud attached. This was a machine. Someone had built it over 2 years, piece by piece, keeping each component separate from the others so that no single exposure could collapse the whole. The only thing they hadn't accounted for was someone sitting on the floor of an office in the early morning dark with 4 years of household ledgers and enough patience to follow a thread. She wrote another letter to Aldridge, this one more urgent. She described Thursday night, named Pete Collar, named Hatcher and Voss, described Purcell's involvement, and requested that Aldridge accelerate whatever filings he could make in Helena without compromising the evidentiary foundation. She gave it to Everett to carry personally, same as before. It was while she was sealing that letter that a thought arrived. Not slowly, the way realizations sometimes build, but all at once, the way a door opens when you find the right key. She sat with the sealed letter in her hands and thought about Harold Fenwick. She thought about his letter to Gideon Mercer, the one Mercer had received the night she'd arrived, the one that said the woman had been dealt with and would leave Iron Hollow within the week. She thought about the timing. The advertisement in the Correspondence Gazette had appeared 6 months ago. She had written to Harold Fenwick. He had written back with warm, careful letters. He had invited her to come. She had come. And at the exact moment she'd arrived on that train platform, at the exact moment Harold Fenwick had thrown that envelope, the county land filings for the Eastern Boundary Challenge were being prepared. She'd found the fraudulent survey, seen the timeline in the forged documents. The filings had been expected to go through within weeks of her arrival. The public humiliation was designed to send her away. She set the letter down. It was designed to send her away before she could become employed by Silas Blackridge, because someone had known that Silas Blackridge needed household help and had been unable to find a reliable person since Agnes was paid to leave. Someone had watched for that opportunity, watched for a woman with skills who might come to Iron Hollow for other reasons and end up in that household, and had arranged to make sure that didn't happen. Which meant someone had known, before she ever arrived in Montana, that Meredith Rowan was coming, which meant Harold Fenwick's advertisement had not been genuine. She sat with that for a moment. The advertisement had been placed to draw her here. The letters had been written to make the offer credible. The plan was to humiliate her publicly, ensure she left Iron Hollow with nothing, and eliminate the possibility of her landing in Silas Blackridge's employment before the land filings completed. Instead, Silas had offered her work on the train platform, the one thing nobody had planned for. She went to find Silas. He was at the north fence with Cal, assessing the cut sections. She walked out to him, coat pulled against the wind, and waited while he finished what he was saying to Cal. And when Cal walked off down the fence line with wire in his hands, she said, "Did you place any advertisement for household help after Agnes left?" Silas looked at her. "No, I was going to, but I hadn't yet. I asked around town a few times. Hadn't found anyone willing to come out this far." "Did you tell anyone you were looking? Anyone in town? At the hardware supplier? At the general store?" He thought. "I mentioned it to the supply merchant when I was in for wire in August. Probably mentioned it at the feed store." He watched her face. "Why?" "Harold Fenwick's advertisement to find a wife," she said. "I thought it was genuine. Now, I think it may have been designed specifically to bring someone with a useful background to Iron Hollow and then drive them away before they could end up here. Silas stared at her. The timing matches, she said. The advertisement appeared 6 months ago. It specifically requested a practical woman, capable of managing accounts and organizing a household. It appeared in a publication that reaches professional women in the eastern states, not the typical channel for a frontier marriage advertisement. She looked at him. They were watching for someone like me to answer it. And when I did, and when my letter showed I could do exactly what they didn't want done in your household, they arranged the reception I got. Fenwick was working with Mercer, Silas said. It wasn't a question. He'd arrived at it a half-second after she said it, which told her he'd been carrying some version of this suspicion already without quite articulating it. Fenwick's family and Mercer's family have a business connection, Meredith said. You told me that the first night. His family and Prentice are on the same lodge committee. She paused. Silas, the humiliation on that platform wasn't just cruelty. It was operational. They needed me gone from Iron Hollow before you could offer me work. He stood very still. The wind moved along the fence line, and neither of them spoke for a moment. You'd been asking around town for help since August, she said. At least 2 merchants knew you needed someone. It would have been simple to watch for an opportunity and arrange to preempt it. Except I was at the train station that day by chance, Silas said. I didn't know you were arriving. I was there for wire and grain invoices. I know, which is why their plan failed. She looked at him steadily. You weren't supposed to be there. Or if you were there, you were supposed to do what everyone else did, watch and walk away. He turned to look at the fence line. She watched him process it, the whole shape of it, the 2 years of careful scheming, the advertisement, the letters, the train platform, all of it designed with a precision that was almost impressive in its ugliness. He used you, Silas said finally. Fenwick. He used you as an instrument in something you didn't know anything about. Yes, she said. He turned back to her. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not just the controlled anger she'd come to recognize, but something that was on behalf of her specifically, directed at what had been done to her specifically, and she found it somewhat harder to look at directly than she expected. Add it to the letter to Aldridge, he said. His voice was very quiet. Fenwick's connection to this. The advertisement. All of it. I already have, she said. I'll write an addition. He nodded. She went back to the house. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote 3 additional paragraphs for Aldridge's letter describing everything she'd worked out about Harold Fenwick's advertisement, including the publication it had appeared in, the specific language of the advertisement itself, which she remembered with near complete accuracy, and the timeline that connected it to the land filing preparation. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she kept her handwriting steady even though her hand wanted to do otherwise. She had known, in some peripheral way, that the advertisement had felt slightly off, the language too specific, the channel too unusual. She had noticed it and told herself it was just the frontier's awkward way of reaching Eastern women through available publications. She'd been so focused on her own circumstances, the closed doors, the dead-end alternatives, the $6 in her boot, that she hadn't examined what she was walking toward carefully enough. She forgave herself for it in approximately 30 seconds, which was all the time she had available for that particular exercise, and then moved on. Thomas Aldridge's response came 6 days later. It was the most substantive letter she'd received from him, several pages in his precise attorney's hand. Gerard Holt's document analysis was complete. The forged signature was formally assessed as a fabrication, with written findings that would hold up to court scrutiny. The independent survey of the eastern boundary was complete, and confirmed that the original 1879 deed description placed the creek line exactly where Silas's records showed, and that the newer survey map Meredith had found in the office was not only inaccurate, but bore markers consistent with having been drawn within the last 18 months, rather than the date it carried. The county registry records in Iron Hollow, when Aldridge's contact had compared them against the territorial archive in Helena, showed 2 discrepancies from the original filed documents. Both discrepancies were in the eastern boundary description. Both had been entered into the local record sometime in the previous 14 months. Aldridge had filed with the territorial court in Helena the previous Wednesday. The filing was formal, documented, and public record as of that date. He had also, through a colleague in the territorial attorney's office, opened a preliminary inquiry into the Iron Hollow County Registry for potential record tampering. Prentice had been named in that inquiry as the local legal officer with administrative access to the relevant records. He was coming back to Iron Hollow himself within the week to begin preparing Silas's formal testimony. He closed the letter with one paragraph that Meredith read twice. Regarding Miss Rowan's analysis of the Fenwick advertisement, I have made initial inquiries, and the connection she describes appears well-founded. I am adding Harold Fenwick to the scope of the inquiry as a potential co-conspirator in the broader scheme. Her identification of this element may prove to be among the most significant contributions to this case. Please convey that to her directly. She folded the letter and put it on Silas's place at the kitchen table and went back to work. He found it at supper and read it there, and when he got to the last paragraph, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at her. She was at the stove. She didn't turn around. He says to convey it to you directly, Silas said. I read it, she said. Don't make a production of it. He was quiet. The filing is what matters, she said. It's in the territorial record now. Whatever Mercer tries from this point forward, legally, he's trying it against a documented case, not just a rancher defending a position. It doesn't stop him from trying other things, Silas said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She turned and put supper on the table. The hands came in and ate, and the conversation was about the fence repair and the cattle count and who was going to ride the North Range tomorrow, the ordinary business of a working ranch. And Meredith sat at her end of the table and ate and listened, and thought that there was something profoundly clarifying about a place where the work was always real and immediate, and didn't wait for you to finish worrying about everything else before it demanded your attention. She slept better that night than she had in weeks. She didn't know why. The situation was no less dangerous. Mercer now knew, or would very soon know, that Aldridge had filed. The polite phase was over. The phase they were entering had no guaranteed shape, but she slept, and in the morning she got up before anyone else and made coffee and stood at her window that faced east and looked at the fence line in the pale early light and thought, we did this. We built this. Whatever happens next, this part is done, and it's solid, and nobody can unfile it. It was enough. 3 days later, Aldridge arrived with two colleagues Meredith hadn't met before, a court recorder and a woman named June Harwick, who turned out to be a paralegal from Helena with an encyclopedic knowledge of territorial land law that made Meredith want to shake her hand and also immediately compare notes on everything they'd each found. June Harwick had the look of someone who had also spent years being the person in the room who did the most work and received the least credit for it, and they understood each other within about 10 minutes. The kitchen table, which had served as Meredith's primary workspace for 2 months, was now formally insufficient for what needed to happen. Silas cleared the dining room, which hadn't been used since before Agnes left, and they spread everything across 2 tables pushed together. All of Meredith's organized files, all of Aldridge's documentation, Holt's written assessment of the forged signature, the survey comparison, the invoice fraud records, the Fenwick connection. They worked for 2 days. Meredith was in the middle of walking June Harwick through her reconstruction of the invoice fraud timeline when the sound of horses on the main road made everyone stop. Not one horse. Several. Cal appeared in the dining room doorway. His face was doing something careful, which was unusual for Cal. Riders on the road, he said. 4 of them. They're not coming fast. They're coming like they want to be seen. Silas was already moving. Meredith followed. On the porch, she counted 5 riders, not 4. Cal had missed one at the back. They stopped on the road outside the main gate, which was the deliberate behavior of people who understood property lines and wanted to make a point of staying just outside them. The man at the front was broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, wearing a coat that cost what Pete Collar probably made in 3 months. She hadn't seen Gideon Mercer before. She understood that's who this was. He didn't come to the gate. He sat on his horse and looked at Silas on the porch from 50 feet away. His expression was the expression of a man who has many levers and wants you to know it. Blackridge, he said, his voice carried without effort. I heard there was some trouble out here recently. I wanted to express my concern. That's very neighborly, Silas said. His own voice was entirely flat. I also heard, Mercer said, and here his eyes moved, just briefly, to Meredith standing at the edge of the porch before returning to Silas. That you've had some legal activity recently. Filings in Helena. News travels, Silas said. It does. Mercer adjusted his reins, a small, unhurried gesture. I'd hate to see a misunderstanding damage what could be a productive relationship between neighbors. If there's some concern about boundaries, some question about the eastern section, I'm sure there's a conversation to be had before things go too far up the court's docket. Meredith watched him. She watched the way his eyes moved, the way his body was angled slightly toward her rather than toward Silas, the way he was talking to the ranch owner while looking at the woman who'd built the case against him. He knew. He knew exactly who she was and what she'd done and where the case had come from. She met his eyes. She didn't look away. I don't believe there's a misunderstanding, Silas said. I believe there's a matter before the territorial court, which means it will be handled there. Mercer looked at him. Courts take time, he said, and things can change while courts are working. Is that a threat? Silas said. It's an observation, Mercer said pleasantly. He pulled his horse around. He and his 4 riders moved back down the road the way they'd come, slowly, without hurry, making sure to be watched the whole way. Silas stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Meredith. She was already thinking, which he could tell by the particular look she had when the machinery in her mind was running faster than she wanted to show. He came to see what we have, she said, to read how far along we are, and to let us know he knows about the filing. And to look at me, she said, to establish that he knows I'm the problem. She paused. It's a pressure tactic. He wants us to know he's watching closely enough to come to the door. He wants me specifically to feel exposed. Silas looked at her for a moment. Does it work? She thought about it honestly. A little, she said. He's a frightening man, not because he's loud about it. No, Silas said. He isn't. They went back inside. Aldridge had come to the window during the exchange and watched. When they returned to the dining room, he said, That was Mercer. Yes, Silas said. He's rattled. Men like that don't make personal appearances when they're comfortable. Aldridge looked at Meredith. He looked at you quite directly. Yes, she said, which means someone told him who built the case. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. We need to accelerate the deposition schedule. I want Silas's formal testimony recorded before the end of this week. And I want yours, Miss Rowan. Your testimony, what you found, how you found it, the methodology, the timeline, needs to be in the court record in your own words, formally sworn, before anything else happens. My testimony, she said. You found the forged document. You identified the invoice fraud. You established the Fenwick connection. You recovered the false survey map. In a legal proceeding, this case stands substantially on what you discovered and the documented method by which you discovered it. Aldridge looked at her with the frank directness of a man who did not deal in false comfort. You understand that if this goes to a full hearing, you will be called to testify before the territorial court. You'll be cross-examined by Mercer's attorneys. They will try to discredit you. They will raise your background, your circumstances, the fact that you arrived in Iron Hollow under particular circumstances that they will try to use to make you appear unreliable. She thought of the train platform, the scattered coins, Harold Fenwick's pink, satisfied face. I know, she said. Are you prepared for that? She picked up her pen. She looked at the pages she'd compiled over 2 months on Silas Blackridge's behalf, all of it meticulous. All of it cross-referenced and documented with the care of a woman who had learned legal methodology at her father's elbow and understood that evidence only works if it's bulletproof. Tell me what format the deposition needs to be in, she said, and let's start. What she didn't tell Aldridge, what she didn't tell anyone in that room, was that the moment Gideon Mercer's eyes had moved from Silas to her on that porch, something had settled into place inside her that she hadn't been expecting. She wasn't frightened in the way he'd intended her to be frightened. She was ready. She had been building toward this testimony for 8 weeks without knowing it was testimony she was building. Every numbered page, every cross-reference, every careful note about where a document was found and in what condition and how it compared to adjacent records. All of it was the foundation of something she could now stand up and defend in a courtroom in front of people who would do everything in their power to pull it apart. She had spent 3 years in Dayton being told that her capabilities didn't count in the rooms where counting happened. She was about to walk into the most important room she'd ever been in. She intended to be counted. The deposition took 3 days. Meredith had given testimony before, twice, in Dayton, as a supporting witness in her father's cases, once before a municipal board review. She knew what a formal legal proceeding felt like from the inside, the particular quality of attention in a room where words were being written down and would outlast the conversation that produced them. She was not unfamiliar with the weight of it. This was different. Aldridge conducted her deposition in Silas's dining room, with the court recorder at the end of the table, and June Harwick present to flag anything that needed clarification before it went into the official record. Aldridge was thorough in the way that good attorneys are thorough, not aggressive, but relentless, circling back to details she'd mentioned in passing and requiring her to expand them, asking for dates she'd stated confidently, and then asking her to explain how she knew those dates, walking her through her methodology for comparing invoice records against physical inventory with the kind of granular precision that would make it impossible for an opposing attorney to find gaps afterward. She answered everything. She was precise. She corrected herself twice when her memory produced slightly different numbers than her written notes, and each time she said clearly, "My notes are accurate, my spoken recollection was off by this amount. I'm correcting the record." Aldridge nodded each time without comment, which she understood as approval. On the second day, he got to the Fenwick advertisement. He walked her through it methodically. The publication, the timing, the language of the advertisement, the correspondence, the letters Harold Fenwick had written. He asked her to describe the content of those letters in detail, including specific phrases she remembered. He asked her to describe the train platform scene. He asked her to describe precisely what Harold Fenwick had said about her age. She described it. Her voice stayed level throughout. Then Aldridge asked, "And it is your assessment, based on the documents you subsequently examined and the timeline you reconstructed, that the advertisement placed by Harold Fenwick was not a genuine matrimonial inquiry, but was designed to bring a woman with a specific skill set to Iron Hollow and then eliminate her presence before she could be employed by Silas Blackridge?" "That is my assessment," she said, "based on the timing, the channel, the language specificity, and the documented relationship between Harold Fenwick and the Mercer family business interests." Aldridge wrote something. He looked up. "How does that make you feel, Miss Rowan, knowing that?" It was an unusual question for a formal deposition. She thought he was giving her room to say something for the record that wouldn't fit neatly into an evidentiary category. She thought about it honestly. "It made me angry," she said. "It still does. Someone read my letters. Letters I wrote with complete sincerity about my circumstances and my abilities, and used them to determine whether I was useful to a scheme I knew nothing about, and then arranged to destroy my options the moment I arrived. That's a particular kind of violation." She paused. "But it also confirmed something I've always believed and sometimes found it difficult to hold on to, that the people who underestimate you are generally the ones who end up needing the most from you in the end." The recorder's pen moved across the page. Aldridge closed his notepad. "I think that's enough for today," he said. The territorial hearing was set for the third week of January in Helena. It was a 6-hour ride, and Silas arranged it so that Meredith, Aldridge, and June Harwick traveled together in a covered wagon with a proper heating element, which was Silas's practical response to the fact that it was now December in Montana, and nobody was going to testify effectively if they arrived frozen. The morning they left, the ranch hands lined up outside without being asked to. Everett, who Meredith was fairly certain had never made a sentimental gesture in his adult life, touched the brim of his hat to her as she climbed up. Cal said, with the earnest intensity he brought to everything, "You're going to do good. I know you're going to do good." Then he seemed embarrassed by this and walked rapidly away toward the barn. She looked at the ranch as they pulled out, the rebuilt fence sections, the barn that stood intact because of a Thursday night in the dark, the kitchen window where she'd spent 2 months of early mornings with a lamp and a ledger, and she felt the particular tug of a place that had become hers in ways she hadn't planned and couldn't fully account for. Helena was a different world from Iron Hollow. The territorial courthouse was a stone building with high ceilings and the institutional cold of places that were designed to be imposing rather than comfortable. Aldridge moved through it like a man who knew every room and every person in every room, which Meredith found reassuring in the way that competence is always reassuring. Mercer's legal representation was a firm out of Billings. 3 attorneys, well-dressed, the kind of legal team that costs enough money to be a statement of confidence before anyone opens a file. They were already in the corridor when Meredith arrived, and one of them, the senior man, gray-haired, carrying a leather case that probably cost more than a month of ranch wages, looked at her with the professional assessment of someone deciding how much of a problem she was going to be. She looked back at him with the same calm she'd used on Mercer's porch. The hearing ran for 4 days. On the first day, Aldridge presented the documentary evidence, the invoice fraud, the supply chain records, the connection to the Mercer family business interests through the Wallace-Mercer silent partnership at Kendrick Supplies. Mercer's attorneys objected 14 times. The presiding judge, a composed woman of about 60 named Harriet Doyle, who had clearly heard every kind of legal argument available to human ingenuity, sustained 2 of those objections and overruled 12. Her manner was the manner of someone who had no patience for theater and considerable patience for fact. On the second day, Holt presented his document analysis. His testimony was precise, technical, and entirely unshakable. Mercer's attorneys spent 2 hours trying to find a crack in his methodology. They did not find one. When they suggested his findings were speculative, Holt produced his equipment log, his comparison protocol, and 3 additional examples from territorial court cases where his methods had been accepted as evidentiary standard. The senior attorney for Mercer's side sat down after that with the particular stillness of a man recalculating. On the third day, Silas testified. I was not a natural witness in the way that some people are. He didn't have the ease of a man comfortable being watched, and there were moments when his jaw tightened and Meredith, sitting behind the rail, wanted to tell him to slow down. But his answers were honest and specific, and he never reached for drama when plain statement would do, which turned out to be exactly right for Judge Doyle, who interrupted him once to say, "Mr. Blackridge, I appreciate the economy of your answers. Please continue." Mercer's attorneys cross-examined him for 3 hours. They tried to establish that he had voluntarily entered into discussions about the eastern boundary, producing the forged correspondence document as their evidence. Silas looked at it and said, "That's not my signature, simply without heat." "And how can you be certain?" the senior attorney asked. "Because I didn't write it, and I didn't sign it," Silas said. "And because a man generally knows his own name." Someone behind Meredith in the gallery made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Judge Doyle did not look up from her notes, but the line of her mouth shifted very slightly. The 4th day was Meredith's. She had slept 4 hours. Not because she was frightened. She had moved past frightened somewhere around the 2nd day of the hearing, replaced by something that felt more like the focus that comes before a difficult physical task. She was cold, she was tired, she was aware that her dress was not as good as it should have been for a territorial courthouse, and there was nothing to be done about that. And she sat in the witness chair and folded her hands on the rail and waited for the first question. Aldridge took her through the full account, her arrival, her employment, the flower inventory that had started everything, the systematic discovery of the financial irregularities, the forged survey map, the correspondence document with the false signature, the Fenwick connection, the night in the barn. He let her speak in full sentences. He didn't interrupt her when she went into detail because the detail was the point. She was on the stand for 2 hours with Aldridge. Then Mercer's senior attorney stood up. His name, she had learned, was Walter Goss, and he had practiced law for 30 years and had a reputation for cross-examination that other attorneys described in terms that suggested he was very good at finding the place where a person's credibility was weakest and pressing precisely there. He started pleasantly, which she expected. "Miss Rowan, you arrived in Iron Hollow in September of this year." "Yes." "Under somewhat unusual circumstances." "I arrived to meet a man I'd been corresponding with." "Yes." "A man who, if I understand your earlier testimony, declined to proceed with the arranged marriage upon meeting you." He threw an envelope at my feet and told me I was too old, she said. "I would describe it as somewhat less dignified than declining." A sound from the gallery. Judge Doyle glanced up briefly. "And within a short time of that," Goss continued, "you were employed by Mr. Blackridge." "Within the same hour, approximately." "So you went from being publicly rejected to being employed by a prominent local ranch owner, all within a single morning." "Yes." "And in the subsequent weeks, you, a woman hired to manage a household, took it upon yourself to investigate your employer's financial records." I was looking for the flower inventory records," she said. "What I found instead warranted further investigation." "In your judgment?" "Yes." "And you had no legal training?" "I had 9 years of practical experience managing the legal and financial records of my father's law practice," she said. "I did not have a law degree. The people who've examined my work in this matter have found it legally sound." Goss shifted. He had been testing the surface and finding it harder than expected. She could see him making the recalculation. Miss Rowan, isn't it possible that a woman who arrived in Iron Hollow in difficult circumstances, with limited resources, having just suffered a public humiliation, might have a personal motivation to find wrongdoing on the part of people she associated with that humiliation? She understood what he was doing. He was trying to reframe everything she'd built as the product of a grievance rather than a methodology. Mr. Goss, she said, the invoice discrepancies are in handwritten ledgers that predate my arrival by over a year. The forged document has been assessed by a qualified document specialist as a fabrication. The altered county registry records have been compared against the territorial archive and found to be inconsistent. The survey map discrepancy was confirmed by an independent survey commissioned after my discovery. She kept her voice even. My personal feelings about Harold Fenwick are irrelevant to whether those things are true. They are true whether I'm angry about them or perfectly content. You are welcome to argue that I found them because I was motivated to look. That's fair. You cannot argue that what I found isn't there. The room was very quiet. Judge Doyle wrote something. Goss tried 3 more angles. She answered each one. She was not combative, that would have been the wrong choice, but she was completely, immovably precise. And precision in an honest witness is something that cross-examination cannot easily destroy because there's nothing soft in it to press against. After 40 minutes, Goss said he had no further questions and sat down. Aldridge did not stand for redirect. He looked at Meredith and gave a single small nod, which she understood to mean that was enough. She stepped down from the witness stand. She walked back through the gate in the rail and sat in her seat and put her hands in her lap and breathed. Silas, sitting to her left, did not make a production of it. He simply moved his arm slightly so that it was adjacent to hers on the shared armrest, present without announcement, and she left her arm where it was. The hearing concluded the following morning. Judge Doyle had heard closing arguments the previous evening and had spent the night with the record. She came to the bench at 9 o'clock and delivered her findings in the measured, unhurried way of someone who had made up her mind well before she sat down and was now stating conclusions for the formal record rather than working through them out loud. The forged correspondence document was ruled inadmissible as a fabrication, supported by Holt's findings. The altered eastern boundary survey was ruled invalid. The original 1879 deed description, as confirmed by the independent survey, was declared the legally operative boundary of Black Ridge Ranch, restoring the northeastern creek access in full. The court ordered a formal review of the Iron Hollow County Registry records in connection with the alterations, to be conducted by the Territorial Registry Office. The invoice fraud documentation was referred to the Territorial Criminal Court for prosecution, with the Kendrick Supplies Silent Partnership, specifically named as evidence of directed rather than opportunistic fraud. Harold Fenwick was named as a co-subject of the criminal referral. Reginald Prentice, the Iron Hollow attorney, was suspended from practice pending the county registry review. The case against Gideon Mercer himself, the man at the center, was not concluded that day because the criminal proceedings were separate from the property hearing and would take additional months to move through the court. But the property was secured, the fraudulent documents were voided, the machine he had built over 2 years had been dismantled piece by piece in 4 days by an evidentiary record he could not overcome. Mercer sat at his table through Judge Doyle's findings with the stillness of a man who had lost something he'd considered certain. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't look at Meredith. He looked at the space in front of him with the expression of a man recalculating not whether he'd lost this, but what it cost him. Gideon Mercer was not a man who surrendered emotionally. He was a man who updated his ledger and moved forward. Meredith understood that. Men like him didn't break, they adjusted. But the adjustment cost something, and watching him absorb that cost without being able to prevent it was the closest thing to satisfaction she was willing to let herself feel inside a courtroom. She waited until they were outside. Then she stood in the cold January air of Helena with Aldridge and June Harwick and Silas, and she breathed, and she let herself feel it. It wasn't triumph exactly. Triumph implied something clean, and nothing about the past 3 months had been clean. It was more like the feeling after a very long piece of difficult work. Not elation, but a deep bone-level acknowledgement that the thing was done and it had held. The criminal proceedings will take time, Aldridge said. He was already thinking forward, which was his nature. But the property case is conclusive. The record is clean. Mercer cannot revisit the eastern boundary in any court without running directly into what we filed today. And the criminal case? Silas asked. Fenwick will cooperate, Aldridge said. Men like Fenwick always cooperate when it becomes clear that cooperation is their best remaining option. And when Fenwick cooperates, Voss becomes easier to reach. And when we reach Voss, he paused. Mercer may never be charged directly. That's the reality of how these things work. But his operation has been dismantled, his land claim is dead, and his associates are facing criminal proceedings. The practical effect on him is significant even if his name stays off the criminal docket. Meredith understood this. It was imperfect. It would remain imperfect. The world did not often deliver the version of justice where the man at the center of a 2-year conspiracy faced consequences proportional to the harm he'd done. What it sometimes delivered was the version where that man's scheme came to nothing, where the thing he'd built collapsed, where the land he'd wanted stayed in the hands it had always belonged to. That would have to be enough. And for now, standing in the cold January air in Helena with the court's findings in the formal record, it was. The ride back to Iron Hollow took most of the day. Silas drove. Meredith sat beside him because Aldridge and June Harwick had papers to review in the back of the wagon, which meant the front bench was quieter, and she found she wanted quiet more than anything else right now. The landscape moved past in the particular way of Montana in winter, vast and gray, and stripped down to its essential structure. No softening left, just the bones of the land showing through. They were about halfway when Silas said, "Your 3 months ended last week." She had thought he'd forgotten. She had almost allowed herself to forget. "I know," she said. "You've stayed past the agreement." "There was a territorial hearing to prepare for," she said. It seemed like poor timing to raise the topic. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily. Somewhere to the north, a hawk was working a thermal, dark against the gray sky. "And now?" he said. "Now that the hearing is done." She looked at the road ahead. It was a question she'd been sitting beside for weeks, the way you sit beside a fire, close enough to feel the heat, not yet ready to name what you're doing there. "I don't know," she said. It was honest. She was usually honest to a fault, and she wasn't going to stop now. "You could go anywhere," Silas said. "You could go back east." With Aldridge's recommendation, and June Harwick's, she told me she intends to write to 3 colleagues about you. You could practice legally now, or close enough to it that it amounts to the same thing. "I know," she said. "Is that what you want?" She thought about Cincinnati, the senior attorney telling her she was wasting her abilities, the 9 months of closed doors, the $6 in her boot, and the broken clasp on her bag. She thought about the kitchen at Black Ridge Ranch at 6 in the morning, the lamp lit, the house still quiet, the particular quality of a problem that was real and immediate and wanted her full attention. She thought about Cal and his genuine biscuits, about Everett's silent notes on the kitchen table, about Silas at the far end of the room reading documents with his coffee going cold, not asking her to explain herself, not requiring her to be smaller than she was. "I want—" She stopped. She started again. "I've spent 3 years wanting to be somewhere my work counted for something. I found that here. I'm aware that's not a simple thing to build an answer out of." "No," Silas said. "It isn't. I'm also aware that I'm a 31-year-old woman who arrived as a mail-order bride and ended up as a housekeeper, and then as a de facto investigator, and then as a witness in a territorial court proceeding, and that none of that is what either of us planned, and that building anything on the back of that particular sequence of events requires—" She paused. "Requires being honest about what we're actually doing rather than what's convenient to call it." Silas was quiet for a long moment. The wagon rolled. The hawk was gone from the sky. "Meredith," he said. "Yes." "I'm going to say something, and I'd like you to let me finish it before you start being sensible at me." She felt something move in her chest that she was not going to examine too closely at this particular moment. "All right," she said. "I have been running that ranch alone for 19 years, he said. "I've been good at it. I've let it become the whole of things. I told myself that was just the nature of the work, that a ranch takes everything you've got, and that's true, but it's a convenient story for a man who stopped knowing how to make room for anything else." He kept his eyes on the road. "In 3 months, you've made room without asking. You've done it by being exactly what you are, which is someone who sees what needs doing and does it without requiring it to be acknowledged or celebrated. He paused. I don't want to offer you a job. I want to offer you a partnership. In the ranch, in everything that comes with it, as an equal. Not because you've earned it as wages, but because the ranch is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it. And I've been aware of that for about 6 weeks, and it seemed like the kind of thing a man ought to say clearly, rather than let it become something that's implied and then eventually assumed and then eventually taken for granted. She listened to all of it. She let it sit for a moment. That's a very considered speech, she said. I've been working on it, he said. Since Billings, approximately. She looked at him. He was looking at the road with the careful focus of a man who has said the thing he needed to say and is now waiting to learn what it costs him. She thought about what she'd said in her deposition when Aldridge had asked her how she felt about being used. The people who underestimate you are generally the ones who end up needing the most from you in the end. She hadn't been thinking about Silas when she said it. She'd been thinking about Mercer, about Fenwick, about the Cincinnati attorney, and all the closed doors and everyone who had looked at her and seen a problem to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. But sitting here now, on a wagon bench in the January cold of Montana, she thought maybe there was another version of that truth. Maybe the corollary was this, that the people who see you clearly, from the beginning, without requiring you to be explained or excused, those people were worth building something with. Silas had offered her work on a train platform when she had nothing. He had let her sit on his office floor with ledgers. He had drunk the coffee she'd moved to a logical location without asking why she'd moved it. He had said, "I'm sorry," in a tone that meant it. He had asked, "What do you need from me?" and then done exactly that. He was not perfect. He'd let his ranch deteriorate for 8 months out of stubbornness and distraction. He'd carried problems alone long past the point where carrying them alone was sensible. He had the particular blind spot of capable men who forget that capability has limits, and he would probably have that blind spot for the rest of his life. She was not perfect either. She was too sharp sometimes in the mornings. She had a tendency to treat problems as intellectual exercises until they became personal, and then she felt the personal part more intensely than she wanted to show. She had come to Montana because she'd run out of other options, which was not the same as coming to Montana because she'd wanted to, and there was a difference between those things that she hadn't fully sorted out yet. None of that was a reason to say no. All of it was a reason to say yes carefully, and mean it, and understand what she was agreeing to. I have a condition, she said. Of course you do, Silas said, not sarcastically, as a statement of fact about who she was, which he'd accepted entirely. The financial records of the ranch, all of them, not just the household accounts, are my domain. Not because you can't manage them, but because I'm better at it, and we both know that, and it will save us an argument later if we agree on it now. Done, he said. And if I think something is wrong, in the accounts, in the operations, in anything I'm responsible for, I say so directly and it gets addressed, not managed or deferred. I'd expect nothing else at this point, he said, and she stopped. She started again more carefully. And I want it understood that I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go. That was true in September. It is not true now. I'm here because I'm choosing to be here, and I want that distinction acknowledged. He looked at her then, away from the road, directly at her, in the way he looked at things he wanted to see clearly. Understood, he said, and acknowledged. She nodded. They rode in silence for a while. Then she said, "The bunkhouse roof on the south end needs attention before spring. There's a seam that's been pulling away from the wall for at least 2 months, and if the snow melt gets underneath it, there'll be structural damage." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I'll get Cal on it next week." "This week," she said. "This week," he agreed. When Blackridge Ranch came into view as the wagon crested the last long rise before the property, Meredith saw it differently than she had the first time. The first time she had seen something neglected, something that needed work, something she could assess for its problems. Now she saw the work she'd already done inside it, the kitchen, the accounts, the records, the testimony, the 3 months of daily attention that had made it run the way a household runs when someone actually cares. She saw the rebuilt fence sections on the eastern side, pale new wood against the older weathered posts. She saw Everett already at the barn as they pulled in, and the slight tilt of his head that was, for Everett, the equivalent of a warm welcome home. Cal appeared from somewhere at a pace just below running. He looked at their faces in the specific way that young men look at the faces of older people returning from something important, trying to read the outcome before anyone speaks. "Well," he said. "We won," Silas said. Cal's face did several things in rapid succession, ending in an expression that was trying hard to be dignified about it and not quite getting there. He turned and walked 3 steps away, and then turned back. "I knew it," he said. "I told Everett. I said, they're going to win." "You told me nothing of the sort," Everett said from the barn door without looking up. "I thought it," Cal said, very loudly. Meredith climbed down from the wagon. The cold hit her full on, the particular honest cold of a Montana January that didn't soften itself for anyone. She stood in the yard of Blackridge Ranch and looked at the kitchen window and thought about everything that had happened in the months since she'd first lit a lamp in that kitchen at 5 in the morning with the house still sleeping around her. She thought about a train platform and scattered coins and a choice she'd made in about 3 seconds to refuse what was offered and keep whatever she had left, which at the time had been almost nothing and had turned out to be enough. That was the thing about almost nothing. It still contained something. And something, in the right hands and the right place with the right kind of stubbornness applied to it, could become almost anything. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She began making supper for 8 people, which was the same as she'd done the first night and every night since, except that she was no longer a woman managing 3 months until she could leave. She was a woman who had decided, with full information and both eyes open, to stay. The criminal proceedings ran through the following spring. Fenwick cooperated, as Aldridge had predicted. Chester Voss was indicted on charges of conspiracy and fraud. Hatcher was located in Red Bend and arrested. The Iron Hollow County Registry was formally investigated, and 2 sets of records were determined to have been altered, both in the eastern boundary description, both within the window Meredith had identified. Prentice was eventually disbarred. Gideon Mercer was never directly charged. Aldridge had warned her this might happen, and she had accepted it with the same honesty she brought to everything. The world did not always give you the ending where the man at the center faced consequences perfectly proportional to the harm he'd done. What it gave you, if you were thorough and honest and refused to stop working, was the machine dismantled and the people it had ground up given back what was taken from them. She was at peace with that, mostly. In March, when the snow was pulling back from the eastern grazing land and the first of the cattle were moving onto the section that Blackridge Ranch now held by clean, uncontested title, Silas and Meredith were married in the yard of the ranch on a morning that was cold but clear, with the ranch hands as witnesses and Aldridge and June Harwick, who had made the ride from Helena, specifically. It was not a large ceremony. Meredith had not wanted one. She had wanted the thing itself, not the performance of the thing. She wore the dress she'd arrived in, the good one, altered at the waist by her own hand over 3 evenings in February. She carried nothing except herself, which was what she'd had on the train platform in September, and what she'd built a life from since. Cal cried. He was extremely embarrassed about this and subsequently denied it entirely, and continued denying it for years with a conviction that was only slightly undermined by the fact that everyone present had seen him do it. Everett shook Silas's hand and then, with a formality that suggested he'd been thinking about it for some time, shook Meredith's hand as well. He said, "You done good." It was the longest unsolicited speech she had ever heard from him, and she valued it accordingly. Standing in that yard with the eastern fence visible in the distance and the cattle moving onto land that was theirs, and no one was going to take, Meredith thought about the woman who had arrived in Iron Hollow with a broken brass clasp on her bag and $6 in her boot and the kind of pride that refuses to bend even when bending would be easier. She had not been looking for this. She had not known this was a thing that existed to find. She had been looking for a place where her work counted for something, where her abilities were a reason to open doors rather than close them, where she could be exactly what she was without apology or reduction. She had found it in a house that needed her. She had built it in a place that became hers through the work of her hands and the exactness of her attention. She had not arrived as a bride. She had arrived as a woman with nothing left to lose, and that particular kind of woman, the one who has already lost almost everything and found out she survived it, is the most difficult person in the world to defeat. Gideon Mercer had known that, in the end. It had simply been too late by then for the knowledge to help him. Blackridge Ranch ran well that spring. The accounts were clean and properly maintained, the supplies properly recorded and cross-referenced, the invoices compared against deliveries with a precision that had, by this point, become second nature to everyone on the property, including Cal, who had developed, under Meredith's influence, a previously unsuspected talent for accurate record-keeping that Meredith chose not to mention to him directly because he would have found it embarrassing. The kitchen window still faced east. She still woke before the house most mornings. She still stood at that window in the early dark and looked at the fence line, at the eastern section, at the land that had been the center of everything. It looked the same as it had always looked from this window. Open, ordinary, the particular Montana vastness that doesn't try to be beautiful, but simply is. She had come across 2,000 miles with a broken bag and $6 and a refusal to pick up money thrown at her feet. She had ended up exactly where she needed to be. Not because the world had been kind, not because anyone had intended her to thrive, but because she had kept working, kept looking, kept following the thread from the flower inventory to the invoice, to the ledger, to the forged document, to the courtroom. One careful step at a time, in the direction the evidence pointed. That was the whole of it, really. That was always the whole of it. You do the work. You follow the truth where it goes. You refuse to put down what you're carrying even when it would be easier. And sometimes, not always, not often enough, but sometimes, what you find at the end of the thread is something you hadn't known you were looking for. Something worth every mile it cost you to reach it.